They built 135 luxury homes on my family's land without permission, then tried to evict me from my own property. You've got to see this to believe it. One lone farmhouse completely swallowed by 135 identical McMansions, like my grandfather's legacy got mugged by a suburban nightmare. I'm Ezra Blackwood, and the woman stomping across my yard with a sheriff's deputy actually thinks she can steal 4 generations of my family's sweat and call it progress. Veronica Ashcroft slides out of her pristine white Tesla, designer heels immediately sinking into farm mud with that perfect squelching sound of karma. The acrid stench of wet concrete from her illegal development battles the sweet honeysuckle my late wife planted. She waves an eviction notice at me like I'm some squatter on my own damn land. "This is a family neighborhood now," she announces with corporate smugness, not some rural eyesore. Thunder crashes overhead as my weathered hand grips the brass dam lever, worn smooth by my grandfather's faithful touch. What would you do if someone stole your family's legacy and called you the problem? Where are you watching from? Let me back up and explain how a peaceful cattle ranch became ground zero for the most brazen land theft in county history. I'm Ezra Blackwood, 4th-generation rancher on 847 acres my great-grandfather Tobias homesteaded in 1889. This isn't just property, it's American legacy, written in weathered fence posts, hand-dug wells, and the massive oak tree planted by a man who believed hard work and honest dealing would build something lasting. 4 generations of Blackwoods have proven him right, until now. The ranch sits on a natural watershed fed by underground springs that bubble up crystal clear year-round. You can taste the minerals in that water, clean and sweet like nature intended, so pure my late wife Sarah used to joke it could cure anything except a broken heart. My grandfather built a small earthen dam in 1962, capturing spring runoff in a reservoir that feeds the creek winding through our entire valley. Sarah understood this land better than anyone. She wasn't just my wife for 26 years. She was an environmental scientist with a PhD who wrote her master's thesis on our exact watershed. Her research documented seasonal flood patterns, wildlife habitats, and the delicate balance that makes this ecosystem work. Losing her to cancer 18 months ago broke something in me that $127,000 in medical bills didn't help fix. Our daughter Emma calls from Seattle every Sunday, begging me to sell and move closer. "Dad, it's just land," she says, not understanding this ranch represents 4 generations of dreams, Sarah's life's work, and Emma's inheritance whether she wants it or not. Everything changed 2 years ago when neighboring rancher Jim Johnson died. His kids couldn't wait to cash out, selling 640 prime acres to Pinnacle Development Corporation for $3.2 million. These corporate vultures immediately offered me $2.1 million, probably figuring a grieving widower would take easy money and disappear. They figured dead wrong. When I politely told them my land wasn't for sale, not today or ever, things escalated fast. Within 3 months, their surveyor had accidentally moved boundary markers 200 feet onto my property. By the time I caught the fraud, construction crews were breaking ground on Ashcroft Estates, 135 luxury homes starting at $485,000 each. Here's the criminal part. They built their community center, playground, and main entrance road entirely on my land, using water from my springs without asking permission or paying a dime. The brass-plated audacity was almost impressive. Steal a man's property while building on it, then charge $500,000 per house for the privilege. But the real insult came driving up my driveway in a white Tesla with Blessed One vanity plates. Meet Veronica Ashcroft, former corporate lawyer turned HOA dictator, married to City Councilman Bradley Ashcroft. This woman makes entitled Karens look humble by comparison. Our first meeting happened while I was repairing fence damaged by their construction trucks. She showed up wearing white designer jeans to a working ranch, stepping carefully around honest mud like it might contaminate her. The sweet scent of Sarah's honeysuckle garden clashed with Veronica's suffocating perfume, something that smelled like artificial flowers drowning in chemical vanilla. She handed me a thick packet of HOA bylaws I'd never agreed to join, then delivered the line that still makes my blood boil. "Mr. Blackwood, this development requires aesthetic consistency. Your rustic approach simply doesn't align with our community standards." I stood there holding fence pliers, staring at this woman on land my family had owned for 134 years, telling me my grandfather's barn violated her standards. Even my rooster Edgar seemed personally insulted. He strutted over and started attacking her designer purse like it had committed a crime against nature. "Ma'am," I replied, fighting back laughter, "my family's been setting the standard here since before your community was a pipe dream in some developer's head." Her corporate smile could have frozen hell over. Well, that's exactly the problem we're here to solve. That night, sitting on the porch where Sarah and I planned our future, listening to coyotes call across pastures where my cattle grazed peacefully, I realized this wasn't just about property lines anymore. This was war, and they'd just fired the first shot. The morning after Veronica's little inspection tour, my mailbox exploded like a legal grenade factory. 47 separate violation notices, each more absurd than the last. Livestock odor on a cattle ranch. Unsightly agricultural structures. Apparently my grandfather's 60-year-old barn offended modern sensibilities. Property value depreciation through incompatible land use. My personal favorite, fence height violations creating visual barriers to community cohesion. Sarah used to say some people could find fault with a rainbow if it wasn't color coordinated with their living room. She would have loved this circus. County Inspector Randy Kowalski arrived at dawn looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Poor guy spent 3 hours photographing every nail and board while Edgar conducted his own inspection, pecking at Randy's clipboard whenever the measurements seemed particularly ridiculous. Mrs. Ashcroft wants documentation down to the quarter inch, Randy explained, wiping nervous sweat despite the cool morning. The acrid smell of his diesel truck mixed with coffee brewing in my kitchen as he measured fence posts with scientific precision. 32 complaints in 1 week. Lady's got dedication, I'll give her that. Each violation carried $500 daily fines starting immediately. Simple math, $23,500 per day unless I magically transformed a working ranch into suburban paradise overnight. At that rate, bankruptcy would arrive faster than winter. Time for professional warfare. Marcus Webb looked like he could arm wrestle a bulldozer and win. This ex-Marine turned property attorney spread survey maps across my kitchen table like battle plans, and within 2 hours started grinning like Edgar discovering an unguarded feed bucket. Ezra, they didn't just screw up, Marcus announced, pointing to overlapping boundary lines. They committed federal crimes, no environmental studies, no wetland permits, and they've been stealing your spring water without legal authority for 2 solid years. Marcus taught me something that should be common knowledge but isn't: prescriptive easement. When your family uses land continuously for over 20 years, you can gain legal ownership through use alone, regardless of who holds the paper deed. My family had worked that disputed strip for 134 years, creating ownership rights that trumped any surveyor's creative math. Sometimes persistence really does beat paperwork. But here's where the day got interesting. Our property survey using ground-penetrating radar revealed my grandfather's original concrete boundary markers from 1962, buried directly under Veronica's community center foundation. They built their entire social headquarters on your land, Marcus explained, studying the radar images with obvious delight. Every HOA meeting is criminal trespassing, and destroying survey markers is a felony. The mini twist. Within hours of discovering this evidence, we filed an emergency injunction to halt all HOA activities on my property. But Veronica struck back faster than a rattlesnake. By 5 p.m. that same day, she'd convinced the county to red tag my barn as structurally unsafe, forcing me to evacuate my cattle immediately or face criminal charges. My counterpunch. Marcus and I drove straight to the county courthouse with our survey evidence. 20 minutes before closing time, we filed a federal lawsuit for civil rights violations, water theft, and criminal conspiracy. More importantly, we demanded immediate seizure of all HOA financial records under federal racketeering statutes. Suddenly, Veronica's emergency barn inspection didn't seem quite so clever. The retaliation escalated immediately. Every HOA resident developed selective blindness whenever I appeared in town. Anonymous calls flooded animal control about my dangerous livestock. Edgar was apparently terrorizing joggers by existing within sight of their precious jogging path. My mailbox became graffiti central, decorated with helpful suggestions like "sell out and move on" and "wrong neighborhood cowboy." The irony was perfect. My family had built this community since 1889, but these California transplants considered me the unwelcome intruder. The harassment turned vicious when I found fresh tire tracks carved through my best pasture and a young calf dead from deliberately cut fence wire. The metallic smell of blood on sweetgrass hit me like a physical blow, proof that Veronica's war had moved beyond legal documents into actual violence. That night, sitting on the porch where Sarah and I used to dream about our future, I called Emma while fireflies danced over her mother's grave, and lights from 135 illegal houses glowed like accusations in the darkness. "Dad, you sound like you're carrying the world," Emma said, worry making her voice exactly like her mother's. Maybe it's time to cut your losses. I'm not just defending our land anymore, sweetheart, I replied, watching shadows move across the valley where 4 generations of Blackwoods had worked and hoped. I'm proving that ordinary people can still win when they stand up for what's right. After a pause filled with 2,000 miles of love and understanding, Emma whispered, "Then win, Dad, but don't you dare fight alone." That's when I realized this battle wasn't about property lines anymore. It was about whether truth and determination could still triumph over money and corruption in modern America. The real war was just beginning. 3 days after our federal lawsuit hit the courthouse, Veronica launched her counterattack with the subtlety of a freight train loaded with entitlement. She called an emergency community safety meeting at the HOA clubhouse, ironically the same building sitting illegally on my stolen land. The woman was using my own property to organize a lynch mob against me. You had to admire the brass-plated audacity. By Saturday afternoon, 89 homeowners had packed into that clubhouse like they were planning D-Day. I could hear their voices from my front porch, carrying across the valley with the kind of righteous fury that only comes from people convinced their property values are under attack. The smell of afternoon barbecues mixed with car exhaust as families arrived for what Veronica had billed as protecting our children's future. Through binoculars, I watched her clicking through a PowerPoint presentation titled Agricultural Intrusion, the Hidden Threat to Family Safety. She actually used photos of my cattle as evidence of disease vectors, my barn as a structural eyesore, and poor Edgar as an aggressive wildlife attractant. According to her calculations, my existence was costing each homeowner $72,000 in lost equity. Sarah would have laughed herself sick. She used to say some people could find a conspiracy in a church potluck if the potato salad wasn't organized alphabetically. The antagonist's move. Veronica presented a petition to the city council demanding immediate agricultural rezoning restrictions and emergency eminent domain proceedings. She claimed my livestock posed health risks, my operations attracted dangerous predators, and my non-conforming structures violated new safety codes she'd helped write. My counterpunch. Marcus and I crashed that meeting uninvited, carrying Sarah's original 1994 environmental research and a briefcase full of federal documents that would ruin Veronica's day. The room went silent like someone had announced an IRS audit. Veronica's face cycled through surprise, rage, and what could only be described as existential panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice cutting through the sudden quiet, "since you're meeting on my property without permission, I thought I should introduce myself properly. I'm Ezra Blackwood, and my family has been protecting this watershed since 1889. Marcus spread Sarah's research across Veronica's presentation table like he was dealing winning cards. Before we discuss property values, maybe we should talk about why this entire development violated federal law from day one." The revelation hit that room like a bucket of ice water. Most residents had no idea they'd bought homes in a federally protected flood zone. Sarah's research had documented seasonal water patterns that made residential construction not just inadvisable but illegal under Clean Water Act protections. During her graduate studies, Sarah had learned something that proved crucial now. Developers often hide environmental problems by burying inconvenient research in bureaucratic filing systems where nobody looks. But when projects receive federal conservation grants, hiding that research becomes criminal fraud. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Marcus had discovered that Pinnacle Development received $3.2 million in federal rural development grants, specifically designated for agricultural heritage preservation and watershed protection. They'd literally stolen taxpayer money meant to protect farmland, then used it to destroy the exact ecosystem they were supposed to conserve. "Mrs. Ashcroft," Marcus announced to the stunned crowd, "your developer didn't just break building codes, they committed federal grant fraud by using conservation funds to destroy protected wetlands, then covered it up by hiding environmental impact studies." Veronica's response dripped with corporate desperation. "The important thing is moving forward with community stability, not getting bogged down in bureaucratic technicalities." That's when the room turned against her. Helen Morse, a retired environmental science teacher, stood up in the back. "Are you seriously telling us we've been harassing the man whose dam has been preventing our basements from flooding for 60 years? Bob Patterson, a grizzled engineer, shook his head in disgust. "I wondered why our insurance was so damn expensive. We're sitting in a natural floodplain, aren't we?" Young father Mike Torres looked genuinely panicked. "Veronica, did you know about these environmental violations when you approved our construction permits?" Amy Chen, a civil engineer, was already pulling up watershed maps on her phone. "If that dam failed during heavy rain, How long before water reaches our foundations? The fear in that room became tangible, mixing with the scent of Veronica's increasingly frantic perfume reapplication as her carefully constructed narrative crumbled faster than a levee in hurricane season. 3 homeowners approached me quietly after the meeting: Helen, Army Corps veteran Jack Castellanos, and Amy. They were exhausted by Veronica's tyrannical rule, but had been afraid to resist individually. "She fined my neighbor $300 for hanging laundry outside," Helen whispered, "because it looked economically disadvantaged." Jack's jaw tightened. "Woman tried to ban American flags for being aesthetically inconsistent." That's when I knew we had a dictator problem. As we walked toward my truck, heated arguments erupted from the clubhouse behind us. Veronica's perfect community was fracturing, and the cracks were spreading faster than water through compromised foundations. My phone buzzed with a text from my insurance company. Policy canceled due to agricultural liability in residential zone. The war was escalating, but now I had allies who understood what we were really fighting for. Veronica's community meeting disaster taught her that public forums only work when you control the narrative. So she decided to hit me where widow ranchers are most vulnerable, straight in the wallet. The woman had been digging through public records like a forensic accountant with a personal vendetta. Somehow she'd discovered Sarah's medical bills, $127,000 in cancer treatment debt that still woke me up at 3 a.m. calculating payment schedules. The metallic taste of panic filled my mouth when I realized how exposed that made me. On a gray Tuesday that smelled like approaching rain and bad news, a process server arrived with legal documents thick enough to insulate a barn. Pinnacle Development was filing mechanics' liens against my property for $89,000, claiming their construction crews had improved drainage systems that benefited my ranch. The audacity was mind-blowing. They'd stolen my land, built on it illegally, then tried to bill me for watching them commit federal crimes. Marcus arrived within an hour, read the liens, and started laughing like Edgar discovering an unguarded feed bucket. "Ezra, they just committed legal suicide. You can't bill someone for unrequested work on their own property. It's extortion wearing a business suit." He explained something called quantum meruit, a legal principle that protects property owners from exactly this kind of scam. It's like a plumber breaking into your house, replacing perfectly good pipes you never asked him to touch, then demanding payment for improvements you didn't want. Courts absolutely hate contractors who pull this nonsense, especially when it involves stolen property. Within days, Veronica launched a coordinated financial assault from multiple directions. State environmental officials suddenly needed to investigate cattle waste runoff based on anonymous complaints. Child Protective Services received reports about unsafe rural environments, despite me having no minor children. My property taxes jumped 340% overnight when the county mysteriously reclassified my agricultural land as development-ready commercial property. But her desperation created the opening Marcus had been waiting for. He filed for emergency court-ordered discovery of all HOA financial records, and what we found was better than Christmas morning. Veronica's landscaping company, Ashcroft Garden Designs, had received $400,000 in no-bid contracts over 2 years. She'd been paying herself with homeowner fees to install overpriced decorative plants and aesthetic improvements that nobody had voted to approve. Self-dealing violations opened the entire HOA board to personal bankruptcy through liability lawsuits. The real smoking gun was buried in city council minutes. Bradley Ashcroft owned 12% of Pinnacle Development Corporation. The man voting on zoning permits was financially invested in the company receiving those permits. Even small-town corruption usually tries to hide the paper trail better than that. The stressed tsunami hit me during routine evening feeding when crushing chest pain dropped me to my knees in the middle of the pasture. The smell of fresh hay mixed with my own fear sweat as I crawled toward the fence, gasping like a landed fish while my cattle watched with bovine concern. 20 minutes later, paramedics were loading me into an ambulance that reeked of disinfectant and other people's emergencies. "Mr. Blackwood, stress is literally killing you," Dr. Patricia Ross explained in the ER, her voice cutting through medication fog with professional urgency. "Your blood pressure could power Christmas lights. Whatever war you're fighting, it's not worth dying over." Emma caught the first flight from Seattle, arriving at my bedside looking exactly like Sarah when she got terrible news, determined, terrified, and ready to manage everyone within shouting distance. "Dad, this is completely insane," she said, gripping my hand while heart monitors beeped reassuringly nearby. "It's just land. Mom wouldn't want you literally dying to defend grass and cattle." The IV drip made everything fuzzy around the edges, but my conviction remained crystal clear. It's not just land, sweetheart. It's proof that honest people can still build something lasting in a world that increasingly rewards corruption over character. Emma's eyes filled with tears that broke my heart because they looked exactly like her mother's. Then let me help you fight, but promise me you won't carry this burden alone anymore. That night, while organizing Sarah's research papers for potential estate planning, I discovered her master's thesis buried in a cardboard box of academic work. Watershed Management and Flood Control in Rural Communities, a case study of Millfield County drainage systems. The cover page made me sit upright despite exhaustion. Her research had focused specifically on our property, the dam, underground springs, and downstream flow patterns that controlled water movement throughout the entire valley. But her handwritten margin note stopped my heart completely. Natural floodplain extends 2.3 miles downstream during 50-year precipitation events. Current development proposals ignore critical drainage patterns and would create catastrophic flooding during major storm systems. Sarah had predicted this environmental disaster 28 years ago, and her research contained detailed calculations showing exactly how much water would flow, where, when nature decided to reclaim its floodplain. My brilliant wife hadn't just studied this watershed, she'd handed me the blueprint for Veronica's inevitable destruction. Thunder rumbled across the valley like Sarah's voice whispering from the grave. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let nature take its course. Reading Sarah's thesis at 2 a.m. felt like receiving a love letter from beyond the grave, except this ghost came armed with 28 years of environmental science and enough legal ammunition to level a corrupt development. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I couldn't stop turning pages. Sarah's research was meticulous, brilliant, and absolutely devastating to everyone who'd been tormenting me. The smell of old paper mixed with the lingering scent of her perfume that somehow still clung to these documents after all these years. Every page revealed another environmental protection law that Pinnacle Development had violated. Sarah had documented seasonal water flows, wildlife migration patterns, and soil composition with the precision of a scientist who knew her work might someday matter to someone she loved. But page 47 stopped my heart. Federal wetland designation maps. The entire HOA development sat in a federally protected flood zone that had been deliberately excluded from impact studies. Those 135 luxury homes weren't just built illegally, they were built in an area that nature reclaims every 15 to 20 years during major storms. My grandfather's dam hadn't just been managing agricultural water for 61 years. It had been preventing catastrophic flooding that would have made residential development impossible. The irony was so perfect it made me laugh out loud, probably disturbing Edgar's beauty sleep in the nearby coop. Sarah's calculations were terrifyingly precise. During a 50-year rain event, the kind that hits every couple decades, natural flood patterns would put 3 feet of standing water throughout the entire development. The underground springs feeding my ranch were part of a massive aquifer system that, when saturated, transformed the valley floor into temporary wetlands exactly like nature intended. While Veronica had been calling my ranch an eyesore, my family had been providing free flood control services worth millions of dollars. Here's where Sarah's environmental genius really showed. She'd researched something called riparian rights, water law that gives upstream property owners absolute control over natural water flow. As long as I used water for legitimate agricultural purposes, I could alter, redirect, or release it however I deemed necessary. Downstream property owners had exactly zero legal claim to flood protection they'd never contracted for or paid to receive. I called Marcus at midnight, probably giving the poor man a heart attack. "Ezra, do you understand what you're telling me?" His voice carried the excitement of a lawyer who'd just found the legal equivalent of buried treasure. "Your wife documented federal crimes that haven't been prosecuted yet. Every homeowner bought property based on fraudulent environmental disclosure. Their insurance policies are void if they weren't properly informed about flood zone status." The legal implications made my head spin. Pinnacle Development had knowingly sold homes in a flood zone without disclosure, violating federal truth in lending laws. The HOA had been collecting drainage fees for flood management they weren't legally providing. Veronica had been fining me for agricultural activities that were not only legal, but essential for preventing the natural disasters that would destroy her precious community. But Sarah's final recommendation, written in her careful scientist's handwriting, gave me the moral framework I needed. Long-term residential development in this watershed requires permanent upstream flood control infrastructure maintained by agricultural operations. Elimination of agricultural use would result in catastrophic property damage during normal precipitation cycles. My brilliant wife had written the environmental protection plan that justified everything I was about to do. I sat at the kitchen table where 4 generations of Blackwoods had made hard decisions, surrounded by Sarah's life's work and the distant rumble of thunder. Her wedding photo smiled at me from the windowsill, and I swear I could hear her voice whispering, "Nature always corrects human mistakes, Ezra. Sometimes we just need to stop preventing the lesson." The Weather Service had issued a severe storm watch for the coming weekend, first major precipitation event in 3 years. Time to let nature be the teacher my wife always knew it could be. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting in my kitchen, the same room where my grandfather had planned cattle drives and my father had survived the Dust Bowl. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with decades of honest conversation as I prepared to plan something that would make both ancestors proud, letting nature reclaim what was always hers. Helen Morse arrived first, carrying coffee strong enough to resurrect the dead and 60 years of environmental science wisdom. When I showed her Sarah's research, her face lit up like Christmas morning. "Your wife was absolutely brilliant," Helen whispered, studying watershed maps with the reverence of someone who understood genius when she saw it. "This methodology is textbook perfect. I'd stake my teaching reputation on these calculations." Helen's motivation ran deeper than scientific appreciation. Veronica had fined her $400 for planting native wildflowers that allegedly violated aesthetic consistency standards. For a woman who'd spent her career teaching environmental conservation, the irony burned like acid. Jack Castellanos rumbled up in his pickup truck that sounded like it had survived Normandy and possibly the Civil War. The Army Corps veteran studied Sarah's dam specifications with the kind of professional respect usually reserved for military monuments. "Your grandfather built this structure right," Jack announced, running calloused fingers along technical drawings. Army Corps couldn't have engineered better flood control in 1962. These brass valves can handle controlled releases that would make Mother Nature herself jealous. Jack's grudge against Veronica was personal too. She'd tried to ban his American flag display for being militaristically inconsistent with community harmony. For a man who'd spent 20 years defending democracy, that crossed every line that mattered. Amy Chen arrived with her laptop, 3 legal pads, and the caffeinated desperation of a working mother fighting suburban tyranny while raising twin toddlers. Within minutes, she was running drainage calculations that confirmed Sarah's predictions with terrifying mathematical precision. "If natural flood patterns resume," Amy explained, fingers dancing across her keyboard, "water reaches foundation level within 48 hours. Not dangerous flash flooding, just persistent, property-damaging saturation that makes homes uninhabitable until natural drainage occurs." Amy's personal motivation was simple. Veronica had threatened to fine her for letting her 3-year-old draw with sidewalk chalk, claiming it created unsightly pavement markings inconsistent with property values. Marcus Webb completed our war counsel, bringing federal statutes and the prosecutorial enthusiasm of someone who'd found the legal equivalent of buried treasure. The taste of victory was already sweet on his tongue as he spread documents across my table. "Here's our legal framework," Marcus announced with obvious satisfaction. "Clean Water Act violations, fraudulent environmental disclosure, and duty to warn requirements. When property sellers hide known flood risks, they face personal liability for every dollar of damage. Our strategy's beauty lay in its simplicity. We weren't breaking laws. We were enforcing ones that had been ignored for decades." Jack walked me through dam operation procedures with military precision. The controls my grandfather had installed were elegantly simple. Brass valves designed to release water gradually over days instead of catastrophically over hours. We calculated flow rates that would saturate soil without creating dangerous surges. "The secret is patience," Jack explained, showing me engineering charts that looked like battle plans. "Open gates slowly, let gravity do the work. Nature doesn't rush disasters. She just persists until she gets what she deserves." Amy designed flooding timeline models using historical weather data and current soil conditions. Her laptop displayed animated water movement that looked like time-lapse photography of environmental justice. 72 hours from initial release to 3 feet of standing water throughout the development, she calculated with engineers' certainty. Houses remain structurally sound but completely uninhabitable until natural drainage restores equilibrium. Helen researched optimal weather conditions using meteorological records spanning back to my great-grandfather's homestead. She identified precipitation patterns that proved Sarah's flood cycle predictions. Every 15 to 20 years, this valley gets storms that remind humans who's actually in charge, Helen explained, pointing to weather data showing decades of natural cycles. We're 3 years overdue for that reminder. Our community outreach began with agricultural heritage tours that revealed history Veronica had tried to erase. I showed curious neighbors the reality hidden beneath suburban development, wildlife corridors, natural springs, and conservation practices that had protected the watershed for over a century. Martha Valdez brought her son to see where his ancestors had farmed before the Depression. Bob Patterson wanted to understand my grandfather's water management engineering. Young families discovered that Edgar the rooster was actually a crucial part of integrated pest management systems. I never realized this place had such incredible history, confessed Amy's neighbor, watching my cattle graze peacefully in pastures that had sustained life for generations. Veronica always claimed nothing important existed here before her development. These quiet allies agreed to document every HOA violation in exchange for learning sustainable land management techniques that might protect their own properties from future environmental disasters. Marcus contacted investigative reporter Dana Kellerman, whose environmental beat had already exposed similar development fraud in neighboring counties. She understood that qui tam lawsuits allow private citizens to sue for government fraud while keeping percentages of recovered penalties. The Weather Service issued the first severe storm watch in 3 years, massive Pacific system tracking directly toward our valley with meteorological intensity that made old-timers check their flood insurance. Everything was ready except my courage to honor the promise I'd made to Sarah's memory. Veronica's private investigator must have been earning overtime pay, because within 72 hours of our kitchen war council, she knew exactly who was meeting at my ranch and why. Her counterattack came with the subtlety of a freight train carrying legal dynamite. The harassment started with Jack Castellanos. According to a sworn complaint filed with the sheriff's office, this decorated Army veteran had aggressively threatened civilian targets during a grocery store encounter. Veronica's detailed statement claimed Jack had approached in a militaristic manner and made coded references to combat operations against community infrastructure. The actual incident, Jack had said, "Morning, ma'am," while reaching for oatmeal in the cereal aisle. The woman was so paranoid she was seeing military coups behind breakfast food displays. Sarah would have laughed until she needed oxygen. But Veronica's desperation ran deeper than grocery store fantasy. Bradley had been fielding panicked calls from Pinnacle Development's corporate lawyers, who'd discovered our federal investigation was expanding into criminal conspiracy charges across 3 counties. Their million-dollar empire was dissolving faster than sugar in a thunderstorm. Her nuclear option arrived Tuesday morning in the form of a welfare check. County Sheriff Mike Rodriguez stood on my porch with Dr. Patricia Ross from Mental Health Services, both looking like they'd rather be investigating actual crimes instead of suburban revenge fantasies. "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Ross began, her professional voice heavy with reluctant duty, "we've received reports suggesting you may be experiencing psychological distress following your wife's death." The morning air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle from Sarah's memorial garden mixed with the sour smell of bureaucratic humiliation. I invited them inside for coffee while Veronica's evidence package spread across my kitchen table like accusations made of paper and desperation. She documented me talking to livestock while feeding cattle, hoarding dangerous equipment by owning farm tools, and maintaining shrines to deceased relatives by tending Sarah's garden. Apparently, grief gardening had become grounds for involuntary psychiatric commitment in Veronica's twisted worldview. Within 30 minutes, Dr. Ross had assessed my mental state and reached conclusions that would permanently torpedo Veronica's credibility. "Sheriff Rodriguez, Mr. Blackwood displays no signs of psychological impairment," she announced with professional certainty. "He's grieving appropriately and maintaining his property responsibly. However, Mrs. Ashcroft's behavior patterns suggest concerning control issues and possible harassment compulsions requiring further evaluation." The taste of irony was sweeter than Sarah's honeysuckle nectar. Veronica's psychiatric warfare had backfired so spectacularly that she'd gotten herself flagged for mental health concerns. But she wasn't finished with her scorched earth campaign. Anonymous reports flooded the USDA claiming my cattle carried mysterious diseases requiring immediate quarantine. When veterinary testing proved my livestock healthier than most suburban house pets, Veronica's landscaping crews began accidentally damaging my infrastructure during routine maintenance on neighboring properties. The acrid smell of diesel exhaust mixed with mounting fury as I watched her employees sabotage water pipes they'd later bill the HOA to repair. The woman was literally breaking my equipment so she could charge her neighbors to fix the damage she'd caused. Thursday morning brought her most desperate gambit. 3 HOA board members filed emergency eminent domain proceedings declaring my ranch-blighted property dangerous to community welfare. The legal filing described 134 years of agricultural heritage as an environmental hazard requiring immediate governmental intervention for public safety. Marcus nearly choked on his coffee reading the paperwork. Ezra, they just handed us a federal civil rights violation wrapped in a bow. You can't declare agricultural property blighted because you don't like the owner's politics. Veronica's social media assault reached professional disinformation levels. She'd created multiple fake accounts spreading rumors about me threatening peaceful families and stockpiling dangerous chemicals. Standard livestock medications had somehow become biological weapons in her fantasy narrative. Her carefully angled photography made my working ranch look like a post-apocalyptic wasteland instead of productive agricultural land. The coordinated email campaign painted me as an antisocial extremist harboring violent grudges against normal suburban families. Defending constitutional property rights had apparently transformed me into a domestic terrorist threat to homeowner associations everywhere. I followed Marcus's strategy: document everything and let Veronica's escalating desperation create the evidence that would destroy her. Every false police report, every fraudulent complaint, every defamatory social media post became ammunition for our expanding federal lawsuit. Meanwhile, the weather was building towards something biblical. The National Weather Service had upgraded their forecast to enhanced risk severe weather event, meteorological language that made old ranchers check their flood insurance and pray for their neighbors' common sense. Friday evening delivered Veronica's final card, a restraining order prohibiting me from altering natural water management systems or engaging in agricultural activities threatening community safety. She'd convinced some judge that my family's 60-year-old water rights posed imminent danger to public welfare. The court order arrived at 5:47 p.m. At 6:23 p.m., federal marshals showed up with warrants to seize Pinnacle Development's financial records. At 7:15 p.m., Dana Kellerman's expose hit the internet: how one HOA president stole a town, environmental fraud and political corruption in rural America. At 8:30 p.m., the first raindrops began falling as storm clouds gathered like nature's own grand jury preparing to deliver overdue justice. By 9 p.m., Veronica had called an emergency Saturday HOA meeting for the same afternoon. Meteorologists predicted maximum storm intensity. Sarah couldn't have timed it better if she'd been directing the weather personally. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of atmospheric pressure that makes old bones ache and smart animals seek shelter. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the clubhouse, ironically the same building sitting illegally on my stolen land while nature prepared to deliver her own eviction notice. By 1:30, 89 homeowners had packed into that space, like passengers on a sinking ship arguing about rearranging deck chairs. The air outside smelled like ozone and approaching judgment, with an undertone of wet concrete that would soon become their most expensive mistake. Through my kitchen window, I could see Veronica pacing inside the clubhouse like a caged animal, gesturing wildly at her PowerPoint presentation titled Environmental Terrorism: Protecting Our Families from Agricultural Extremists. The woman was actually trying to frame me as a terrorist for defending land my family had owned since before her grandparents were born. Rain began tapping against my windows like nature's own drumroll announcing the main event. Marcus and I walked into that clubhouse uninvited, our boots tracking honest mud across Veronica's pristine floor. The room fell silent except for the sound of raindrops hitting the roof with increasing intensity. I could smell collective fear mixing with too much cheap perfume and the metallic taste of panic. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, rainwater still dripping from my hat. "Since you're meeting on my property without permission again, I thought you should understand what's about to happen to your investments." Helen Morse stood up from the back row. Sarah's environmental research clutched in her hands like evidence in a murder trial. "Before we discuss terrorism, maybe we should examine why this entire development was built illegally in a federally protected flood zone." The words hit that room like lightning striking dry timber. Marcus spread Sarah's 1994 watershed maps across Veronica's presentation table while Amy Chen pulled up real-time weather radar on her laptop. 28 years of environmental science proving that 135 homes had been built in nature's designated flood storage area. "Your developer used $3.2 million in federal conservation funds to destroy the exact wetlands they were paid to protect," Marcus announced to the stunned crowd. "They committed environmental fraud by hiding studies that predicted catastrophic flooding during normal precipitation events." That's when Veronica made her fatal mistake. Instead of damage control, she doubled down on desperation. This is environmental terrorism, she shrieked, pointing at me like I'd personally summoned the storm clouds gathering outside. He's manipulating weather data to create panic and destroy our property values. The room erupted in chaos. Martha Valdez jumped up. Are you seriously claiming he controls the weather? We've been harassing the man whose dam has been protecting us for 60 years. Bob Patterson, his engineer's mind already calculating flood damage. Veronica, we're sitting in a natural drainage basin. Our flood insurance rates should have been the first clue. Young mother Amy Chen was frantically checking evacuation routes on her phone. If that dam releases water naturally, how long before it reaches our foundations? What about our children's safety? Outside, the rain intensified from gentle drops to serious precipitation. The sound on the clubhouse roof changed from tapping to drumming to the kind of steady roar that makes farmers smile and developers panic. At 3:47 p.m., Veronica's phone buzzed with the text that destroyed her remaining credibility. Breaking, federal marshals arrest Pinnacle Development executives for environmental fraud across 3 states. At 4:15 p.m., Dana Kellerman's follow-up story went viral. HOA president's husband owns stake in fraudulent development company. At 4:23 p.m., the fire alarm in the clubhouse started screaming because water was pouring through the roof into the electrical system of a building that should never have been constructed in a flood zone. As families evacuated the flooding clubhouse, Veronica stood in ankle-deep water screaming about property values, while Mother Nature demonstrated exactly how much she cared about suburban real estate prices. 3 homeowners approached me in the parking lot as rain soaked through everyone's clothes: Helen, Jack, and Amy. They were no longer afraid of Veronica's retaliation because they were terrified of something much more immediate. "Mr. Blackwood," Amy said, shouting over the storm, "my engineering calculations show this rain isn't stopping. If your dam reaches capacity naturally, how much warning do we have?" Jack checked his phone for weather updates. "National Weather Service just upgraded to flash flood emergency. We're looking at 6 inches in the next 4 hours. Helen grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Your wife's research predicted this exact scenario. What would she tell us to do?" I looked at these people who'd been my enemies an hour ago, now seeking salvation from the man they'd been trying to destroy. The rain was coming down harder, and I could feel the weight of 61 years of Blackwood stewardship pressing on my shoulders. "Sarah would tell you that nature doesn't negotiate," I replied, watching water pool around the foundations of houses that should never have been built. "She'd also tell you that I've got exactly 45 minutes to make the hardest decision of my life." Lightning split the sky like God's own signature on nature's eviction notice. The storm was here, and it was time to choose between mercy and justice. By 9:15 p.m., the rain was coming down like God had opened every faucet in heaven and forgotten where he'd put the shutoff valve. I stood at my grandfather's dam controls, brass levers worn smooth by 6 decades of faithful hands, while 200 people gathered on higher ground to witness either salvation or the reckoning Veronica had been earning for 2 years. The controlled release began slowly, exactly as Jack had taught me. No dramatic flourishes, no Hollywood explosions, just the quiet opening of gates designed by a man who understood that nature's power demands respect, not theatrics. The sound of rushing water mixed with rain drumming on everything that hadn't been smart enough to seek shelter. Within minutes, the controlled flow began following paths my family had managed for 134 years, seeking the natural drainage patterns that Sarah had documented in her research. Water doesn't lie, cheat, or file fraudulent lawsuits. It simply goes where physics and gravity demand, regardless of property lines drawn by corporate lawyers. Jack monitored downstream flow from his pickup truck, radio crackling with updates. "Perfect execution, Ezra. Water rising steadily, no dangerous surge patterns. This is controlled flooding, not catastrophic failure." Amy Chen broadcast live updates on emergency radio channels. "Attention all residents. This is managed water release following natural drainage patterns. Evacuate basements, move vehicles to high ground, but there's no immediate structural danger to homes." The media convergence was immediate and overwhelming. Dana Kellerman broadcast live from the HOA clubhouse as water began seeping through foundations that should never have been poured in a flood zone. 3 news helicopters circled despite weather conditions, their searchlights illuminating the surreal scene of luxury homes slowly disappearing into standing water. Cell phone videos went viral within hours. HOA Karen gets environmental justice from Mother Nature, trending nationally on social media, while hashtags like #FloodJustice and #NatureWins spread faster than the water itself. County Sheriff Mike Rodriguez arrived, surveyed the situation, and made the announcement that validated everything we'd been fighting for. No laws have been broken. Mr. Blackwood is operating legal water management infrastructure on his own property. Anyone with concerns should contact their insurance companies and real estate attorneys. When Veronica demanded my arrest for environmental terrorism, Sheriff Rodriguez's response was perfect. "Ma'am, you might want to focus on calling your lawyer instead of harassing the man whose family has been preventing worse flooding for 6 decades. The community witness was unprecedented. Martha Valdez live-streamed from her evacuated home. "Y'all, we're watching 134 years of environmental karma get delivered by the most patient man in America. That dam has been protecting us all this time, and we never even knew it." Bob Patterson provided engineering commentary to news cameras. "This controlled release is preventing what would have been catastrophic flash flooding during future storms. Mr. Blackwood just saved lives while teaching us about environmental responsibility." Children splashed in puddles while adults documented property damage for insurance claims that would expose the largest real estate fraud in county history. The scene was surreal. Families picnicking on high ground while watching their HOA president's empire literally wash away. Then came my mic drop moment. A news reporter shoved a microphone toward me as I stood watching water reclaim land that had been stolen through lies and corruption. "Sir, what's your response to critics who say you've destroyed a community?" I looked at the camera, rainwater dripping from the brim of my grandfather's hat, and delivered the line Sarah would have been proud of. "I didn't destroy anything, son. I just stopped preventing nature from fixing what was broken." A second reporter pressed harder. "Do you feel guilty about the property damage you've caused?" My response came from 61 years of watching my family protect this watershed. "Ma'am, my wife researched this for 4 years and predicted exactly what you're seeing tonight. Every family here should be thanking her for the warning they got, instead of the catastrophe they would have faced during the next real flood." FBI agent Sarah Chen announced arrests for wire fraud, environmental violations, and conspiracy while standing knee-deep in the evidence of their crimes. Pinnacle Development and certain HOA officials knowingly violated federal wetland protections and defrauded homeowners about flood risks. The visual was perfect poetry. Luxury homes sitting in 3 feet of standing water while my farmhouse remained untouched on high ground, American flag flying proudly in the storm wind. Nature had delivered her verdict, and it was unanimous. As dawn broke over the transformed valley, wildlife returned like they'd been waiting years for this moment. Herons waded through restored wetlands, frogs provided a chorus that drowned out suburban complaints, and Edgar strutted around his expanded territory like he'd personally negotiated the flood. Veronica was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about property values while standing in ankle-deep proof that some things matter more than money. Bradley had already been arrested at the airport, caught trying to flee with $340,000 in cash that couldn't buy him a way out of federal prison. The community transformation was immediate. An emergency town hall voted unanimously to dissolve the HOA and form an environmental conservation district. Amy Chen was elected temporary coordinator, Jack Castellanos organized volunteer flood recovery efforts, and Helen Morse led the effort to establish permanent wetland protections. Nature had taught her lesson, and for once humans were smart enough to listen. 6 months after nature delivered her verdict, the valley had transformed into something Sarah would have called a miracle. What started as environmental justice had bloomed into genuine community healing, proving that sometimes the best way to build something beautiful is to let nature show you how it's supposed to work. The insurance settlements came through faster than anyone expected. $47 million in flood damage claims, with every HOA resident receiving an average of $180,000 for undisclosed flood zone fraud. Pinnacle Development's corporate bankruptcy meant homeowners could sue individual executives personally, and most did. 89 families chose to relocate rather than rebuild in a restored wetland, but 46 families stayed and worked with me to develop sustainable housing that respected natural flood patterns. These weren't the same neighbors who'd harassed me 2 years ago. These were people who'd learned the difference between fighting nature and working with her. My health improved dramatically once the stress of legal warfare disappeared. The heart palpitations vanished, blood pressure returned to normal, and I started sleeping through the night again. Funny how much better you feel when you're not carrying the weight of other people's corruption on your shoulders. Emma moved back from Seattle that fall, bringing her software engineering skills and her mother's environmental passion. Together we converted the ranch into the Sarah Blackwood Memorial Wetland Preserve and Environmental Education Center, using federal grant money that actually went toward conservation this time. Helen Morse and I began dating 6 months after the flood, much to Emma's delight and Edgar's apparent approval. Sarah would have wanted me to find happiness again, and Helen understood both the land and the man who'd spent his life protecting it. She moved into the farmhouse that spring, bringing 60 years of teaching experience and a laugh that reminded me why life was worth living. The legal victories kept coming. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced Veronica Ashcroft to 4 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and environmental crimes. Bradley got 6 years for public corruption and money laundering. Their legal precedent, officially called the Blackwood Doctrine, now protects agricultural water rights from development pressure in 12 states. Pinnacle Development executives faced additional charges across 3 states, with Dana Kellerman's investigative reporting exposing similar fraud affecting over 400 families. Her environmental journalism series won a Pulitzer Prize, and she used her acceptance speech to honor Sarah's research that had made the exposé possible. The Sarah Blackwood Environmental Science Scholarship Program launched with settlement money, providing full tuition for students studying wetland restoration and sustainable development. Our first recipient was a local high school senior whose research project documented native species recovery in the restored watershed. Amy Chen leads our Youth Conservation Corps, teaching teenagers how sustainable development can work with natural systems instead of against them. Jack Castellanos trains young people in traditional water management techniques that have protected this valley for over a century. The program has a 2-year waiting list, and colleges actively recruit our graduates. The environmental impact exceeded everyone's expectations. The restored wetland became critical habitat for 47 bird species, including endangered migrants that hadn't been seen in the valley for 30 years. Water quality improved 340% downstream, benefiting 3 communities that had been dealing with agricultural runoff problems for decades. Native plant restoration provided seeds for regional conservation projects, and our climate change research station studies natural flood management techniques that could protect communities throughout the watershed. The irony is beautiful. Veronica's attempt to destroy agricultural land created the most successful conservation project in county history. Every spring, we host Wetland Day Festival, drawing 5,000 visitors who come to learn about environmental stewardship, sustainable agriculture, and the legal protections that make conservation possible. Children splash in clean streams, while their parents attend workshops on everything from water rights to wildlife habitat management. This year's festival featured a special tribute to Sarah's environmental research. I spoke to the crowd about the woman whose scientific work had saved a valley and the community that had learned to listen to nature's wisdom. My grandfather built that dam to protect the land. My wife studied how to restore it. All I did was step aside and let both of them be right. Edgar still leads guided tours, wearing a tiny conservation badge that makes visitors smile and remember that every creature has a role in protecting the places we love. Even Veronica's former Tesla has been converted into a mobile environmental education unit, proving that redemption is possible for everything except the people who refuse to change. The final irony writes itself every morning when I sit on the porch where Sarah and I planned our future, watching sunrise paint golden light across wetlands that wouldn't exist without her research and her love for this land. Our fight was never about defeating enemies. It was about proving that truth, patience, and respect for natural law could still triumph in a world that had forgotten those values. Share your HOA nightmare stories in the comments. You might be surprised by your legal options. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people standing up to corrupt systems. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let nature take its course.